You're listening to Himalayan Adventure by Vaile. Chapter 15.
With the windscreen gone, the sweet-smelling air of the cool mountain night flowed into the bus. The air inside the bus that the passengers had been breathing for the past 7 hours had become very stale, and if there was a scientist present with the appropriate equipment to measure such things, the air would have been found to contain low levels of oxygen and a dangerously high concentration of carbon dioxide. If the GXs had failed to find the bus and pull it free, the rising CO2 would have slowly poisoned everybody with every breath. The fresh air drifting into the bus revitalized the passengers, and the growing lethargy of the last few hours was suddenly replaced with a new urgency to escape from the dark and crowded tomb. Many of the passengers scrambled forward desperately, clawing their way over anything in their path. Gulbenkian and Burnmaster pulled the 14-year-olds aside to prevent them getting trampled by the exodus. It would be unfortunate, to say the least, if they all survived the landslide only to have one of their number killed in the stampede to get off the bus. "I thought you said there was no way a rescue team could get to us," Isabelle said to Pemba, who had also decided to wait out the rush. "But there isn't," he replied, shaking his head. "So who saved us?" she asked. "I saw a giant silver-haired man stare through the windscreen," volunteered Gulbenkian. Now that the danger had passed, his usual stutter was back. "He didn't look very Nepalese, so that rules out Zaw and Abby," thought Pemba. Even though he had no idea how they could have done it, the only thing he could think of was that his furry friends had somehow managed to mobilize a yeti rescue team fast enough to dig the bus out from under the landslide. But if what Gulbenkian had seen was true, the yeti had nothing to do with the miraculous rescue of the bus. Which was good, because the secret of the yeti was far too valuable to throw away just to save his life. The queue of people scrambling to get out of the bus became shorter and shorter until only Burnmaster and his companions remained. Isabelle usually made a point of being at the front of every queue, and she briefly wondered how she had ended up at the back of this one, probably the most important queue of her life. Mental note to self, she thought, don't let other people push in front when it's a matter of life and death. She watched Laheeti scale the boulder and then scramble through the gaping hole and onto the bonnet of a car. Then it was her turn. Gulbenkian gave her a push from behind, and suddenly she was up and out, free of the claustrophobic confines of the bus, and staring up at the vastness of the night and its constellations of brilliant white stars. For a moment she was speechless, happy to be alive and free. She looked down and realized she was standing on the bonnet of a car that had been crushed from several different directions, and as she moved towards the edge so she could jump down onto the road, a giant hand extended towards her, palm up, offering assistance. She looked from it to its owner, a giant, silver-haired man, just like Gulbenkian had said. As she offered him her hand, she realized who he was, one of the men she had seen standing on the runway at Tribhuvan Airport when she arrived in Nepal. She also remembered the rude thing she had said about him and felt a sudden pang of shame. After wordlessly guiding her down to the road, the giant man turned back to help the others out of the bus. Soon everybody was standing together on the mountain road, exchanging warm embraces. The relief felt by all was somehow richer when shared. There were tears, too, shed quietly. Isabelle cried for happiness and for sadness, because the old lady who had been sitting next to her on the bus would never leave it. Satisfied that everyone was okay, Burnmaster turned his attention to the 3 silver-haired giants who were standing nearby and shouldering on their rucksacks in preparation to leave, apparently without saying goodbye. When Burnmaster had stepped from the bus, he had expected to see the area clogged with rescue vehicles and ambulances, and crawling with uniformed men and women all working diligently to dig the bus out. But after casting his gaze around the darkness and the emptiness of the mountain road, he was forced to conclude that those 3 men were the entire rescue team that had pulled the bus out from under the landslide. Isabelle followed Burnmaster's gaze and asked, "Do you think they saved us all by themselves?" "They must have, because there's nobody else around here," he said. "I figure I'd better go and thank them for their efforts." He glanced down at her and added, "You stay here." He started walking towards the giants. Isabelle let him get 6 strides ahead and then started after him. She wanted to get a better look at the silver-haired giants up close, and besides, she had to say her own thank you too for saving her life. "Isabelle," hissed Twig. "Burnmaster said to, like I always do what Tom tells me to do," she replied over her shoulder. Twigger and Laheeti looked at each other, shrugged their shoulders and followed her, with Pemba and Gull trailing along too. The giants' clothes and faces were smeared with black mud, so there was no question they had been closely involved in the rescue. Anybody who was standing back and watching couldn't have gotten so dirty. In fact, judging from the state of their clothes, they had been standing in mud up to their armpits or further. She looked more closely at their faces. They were the three faces she remembered seeing on the tarmac at the airport in Kathmandu. Identical and odd. Other than the garish silver hairstyles, the oddness of their faces was something she couldn't quite put her finger on. They were clearly human, it would have been ridiculous to think otherwise, but their faces were different somehow. The eyes, ears, noses, and mouths were all there, but the proportions were slightly off, and they were faces that looked permanently angry, especially the giant with the flat-top hairstyle. He looked like he'd been born with a frown on his face. Combined with his granite jaw and teeth that looked like they could chew through iron bars, he was a menacing sight. All three giants stopped talking and turned to face Burnmaster. That was when he realized just how big they were. Gulbenkian was big, but these guys were positively huge. Burnmaster's pace slowed slightly under the unflinching gaze of their small, black eyes. One of them shone a torch at him, blinding him for a moment. Given that they had just saved he and his companions from certain death, he was expecting a little more warmth from the tall strangers. He looked again, but there were no smiles on their wooden faces. He stopped, they stared down at him. He wondered if they spoke English. Just want to say thank you for helping us, he began, watching for any indication that they understood what he said. It was you three that dug the bus out from the landslide, wasn't it? The one with the flat-top hairstyle pointedly ignored Burnmaster by turning away and busying himself with wiping the mud off his face with a cloth. For a moment, Burnmaster wondered if his friendly question had been misinterpreted as a rude gesture. He had visited many countries around the world, and he knew that friendliness in one culture could sometimes be misunderstood as hostility in another. The last thing he wanted to do was get on the wrong side of these guys. For one thing, they had saved his life. The other reason was that they were huge and looked really, really strong, dangerously strong. Not the kind of people he wanted to upset. That's right, Maine replied in English. Now that he had saved these people, he wasn't sure what to say to them. He was trained to take lives, so it was a strange feeling talking to somebody whose life he had actually saved. His military training didn't include how to make small talk. I'm glad you're all okay, he added. Burnmaster noted the English was foreign-sounding, but he couldn't place the accent. He heard somebody stop behind him and saw that it was Isabelle and the others. That girl never does what I tell her to do, he thought to himself. Turning back to the giants, he said, well, as you can see, we're all okay, thanks to you guys. Yes. I want to say thank you too, Isabelle said. The thought of being trapped in that bus forever is just horrible, and if you guys hadn't come along, that is just where we would be. Twig and Laheeti mumbled their agreement. I'm glad we could help, Maine replied, and then his stony face broke into a broad, friendly grin. Burnmaster relaxed when he saw that smile. There is something about a sincere smile that puts strangers at ease, even when it's a smile on the face of a silver-haired, odd-looking giant. But there's one thing I don't understand. How did you winch the bus out of the landslide? Asked Burnmaster. Maine frowned at the unfamiliar word. Winch, he repeated uncertainly. Yes, you know, a winch, Burnmaster said. A machine to pull the bus out. There's no machine, Maine replied. We pulled the bus out ourselves. A sudden thought struck him. Had he compromised their cover story by saving the passengers on the bus? If that happened, Flattop would never let him forget it. Is that weird? He asked. No, it's not weird, answered Isabelle. By Nepalese standards, it's totally normal. What do you mean, by Nepalese standards? Asked Pemba. Well, you told me that 2 of your friends are talking yetis, Isabelle answered pointedly. So, by those standards, 3 huge guys pulling a bus out of a landslide is very normal. Flattop's hand holding the cloth paused. He turned around and fixed his unblinking black eyes on Pemba. The 15-year-old Nepalese boy licked his lips nervously. Ever since he'd stepped off the bus, he'd been trying to find the right moment to casually raise the topic with Isabelle. He needed to convince her that what he had said about talking yetis and a place called Shangri-La had all been a silly joke. Just a dumb story to take her mind off the hopelessness of their situation when they were trapped on the bus. You have 2 friends that are talking yetis? Asked Flattop. No, of course not, Pemba stammered, as if that's possible. Right, I've never heard anything more ridiculous in my whole life. He laughed half-heartedly, leaned closer to Flattop and dropped his voice a notch. Just between you and me, I think she's a bit, crazy, he said, motioning in Isabelle's direction. No doubt because of the stress of being trapped on the bus and everything. We really should get her to a hospital. I am not going crazy, Pemba, and don't you dare suggest that I am, exclaimed Isabelle. Pemba snapped his fingers, feigning sudden understanding. Oh, I know what you're talking about, he said. When we were trapped on the bus, you asked me whether I believed in yeti, and I said no, but you looked so serious about it, I figured I'd tell you a story to make you feel better, so I made up a story about talking yeti. It was all make-believe. I wasn't being serious. Pemba emphasized all the important parts to help get his point across. So you were lying, exclaimed Isabelle. I knew it. Of course I was lying, Pemba said nervously, watching everybody closely to measure their reactions. It looked like they were buying it, and he hastily continued. Everybody knows there's no such thing as talking yeti, or even ordinary, dumb yeti that forage around in the mountains, for that matter. Burnmaster shook his head. Anyway, he said, interrupting the odd conversation between Pemba and Isabelle, I'm still not sure how you guys dragged the bus out of the landslide, but you saved our lives, so I guess it doesn't really matter. Flattop was still looking at Pemba suspiciously. There was an awkward silence, and then Isabelle thrust her right hand out suddenly. My name is Isabelle, she said. After thinking about how to translate his nickname into English, Maine introduced himself and shook her tiny hand. Maine, Isabelle said with a frown, I've never heard that name before. It's kind of a nickname, Maine explained. Ah, she said, and your brothers, how do you know we're his brothers? Grunted the giant with the flat-top hairstyle. Because you all look 100% identical, thought Isabelle. Just a guess, she said conversationally. Maine gave Flattop a warning glance, then said to Isabelle, You're right, we are brothers. This is Flattop and this is Mohawk. Mohawk nodded his head in acknowledgement, and Flattop grunted something before picking up a cloth from the top of his rucksack and continuing to wipe the mud from his face and clothes. Mohawk, Maine, and Flattop, mused Isabelle. All named after your hairstyles, right? That's cool. Are you guys in a band or something? Yeah, we are, laughed Maine, and we're university students from South Korea. What are the names of your friends? Isabelle introduced everybody, and when she looked back up at the silver-haired giants, their expressions had changed slightly, especially the one called Flattop. He looked like a cat that had just seen a plump mouse scurry by. Gulbenkian, Flattop said, standing up to his full height. He was several inches taller than Gull, and there were very few people in the world who could look down on the huge islander. That name sounds familiar, he mused. I was in an international sumo wrestling competition in Japan last year, stammered Gull. Perhaps you read about me in the newspaper. The chances of that having occurred were exactly 0 because the North Korean military did not allow the GXs any access to newspapers or the internet. None of the GXs had ever heard of sumo wrestling, and they didn't have the faintest idea where Japan was. That might have been it, replied Flattop, knowing full well that the last email from North Korea had flagged that a group of travelers in Nepal, including an islander called Gulbenkian, might know where Nicky Zipster was. What are you doing here in Nepal? Asked Mohawk. This was a topic that Burnmaster wanted to avoid. We're, sightseeing, he replied quickly before any of the others could answer. Just traveling around Nepal, we're travelers. What about you guys? Same story, he asked. Actually, we're looking for somebody named Nicky Zipster, replied Flattop coolly. There was an article on the internet recently about her seeing a yeti in the Himalayas. We want to talk to her about that, for our studies at university, of course. Before Burnmaster could respond, Isabelle exclaimed, Are you kidding? We're also looking for Nicky Zipster. Then Burnmaster cut her off with a stern glance. Even though these 3 giants had saved their lives, he didn't know them from a bar of soap and didn't trust them either, especially the one called Flattop. Unfortunately, Isabelle's outburst meant the cat was out of the bag on why Burnmaster was in Nepal, but the less the trio of giants knew about his plans, the better. Like Isabelle says, we are also looking for Professor Nicky Zipster, Burnmaster said coolly. But apparently she went to the mountains the north of here a few days ago. You guys know any different? Maine shook his head. We heard the same thing. Did you know that Nicky's office at Kathmandu University was recently broken into? Asked Isabelle. The question caught the GXs off guard, and they blurted out responses in unison. Are you serious? Exclaimed Maine. No way, said Flattop. I don't believe it, gasped Mohawk. It's true, replied Isabelle, and whoever broke in completely trashed the place. Isabelle didn't notice the GX's nervous responses, but Burnmaster did. How did you find out that Nicky is missing in the mountains? He asked. After we landed in Nepal, I called Kathmandu University to arrange a time to meet Nicky Zipster, explained Flattop. The person on the phone told me that she hadn't returned from Langtang National Park. Burnmaster nodded. It was possible, but it was also possible that these were the guys who tore up Nicky's office and read the sign on the door like he did. Hey, I've got a great idea, said Isabelle. Let's join forces. We all want the same thing, to find Nicky, right? So it makes sense that we work together. Maine's silver eyebrows rose up in surprise. That's not a bad idea, Isabelle, he agreed. I think we should take things one step at a time, Burnmaster replied, but there's no reason we can't travel to Shabrubessi together. I presume that's where you're going. That's right, said Maine, but it's going to be a long walk from here. We won't have to walk the whole way, said Pemba. A truck will come along this road sooner or later and we'll be able to get a lift. Let's hope it's sooner, not later, said Twig. Everybody hefted their backpacks and started walking in the direction of Shabrubessi. Isabelle hurried along beside the long, slow strides of Mohawk. Is Maine all right? She asked. He looks kind of stressed out. Don't mind him, Mohawk said. It's just that he doesn't like the dark very much. Burnmaster was walking beside Laheeti and Twig. I've been meaning to ask you two something, he began. Could you do me a huge favor and not tell your parents that you were almost killed in a landslide? Because if you do, I'll be in a whole lot of trouble when we get back to Vavu. Especially your dad, Laheeti. I don't know if the king wants to know that his only son was down to his last few hours of air in a bus buried in mud. The secret is safe with me, said Laheeti with a laugh. Further back, Pemba fell into step with Gulbenkian. So you're a sumo wrestler? He asked. No, I just competed in one competition, that's all, stammered Gull. How'd you do? Pemba asked. I won, Gull replied. Cool, Pemba said, nodding appreciatively. Meanwhile, Flattop exchanged a meaningful glance with Maine, and the pair drifted to the back of the group. Not so far back that they were out of earshot, but that didn't matter because they were speaking in North Korean, and there was little chance that their new traveling companions could understand that language. Flattop tried to read his brother's expression in the yellow torchlight. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? He asked. That seemed unlikely, given that Flattop was as much the loyal soldier as ever while Maine was seriously questioning everything he had been brainwashed to believe by the North Korean military machine. I'm not sure, began Maine. What are you thinking? Burnmaster definitely knows more about Nicky Zipster than he is saying, Flattop explained. We should roll him and his friends to find out everything they know. Maine's face turned pale at the idea and he hoped his brother thought it was because of his fear of the dark. You mean torture them for information and then kill them? He gulped. Right, Flattop's mouth twitched as he smiled, and this is the perfect place for it, a deserted mountain road in the middle of nowhere. As far as the rest of the world is concerned, Burnmaster and his friends just got swept away by a landslide. Nobody would ever find out what really happened to them. Maine kept his face expressionless, but he was privately horrified by the idea. He had just spent the past 6 hours saving their lives, and now Flattop wanted to kill them. It was out of the question, but he definitely couldn't tell his brother that he didn't want to do it because he, GX2, a highly trained North Korean commando, was not in the killing business anymore. He needed to think of a reason to convince Flattop that taking out Burnmaster and his friends would be a tactical error in their mission to recover the Yeti tooth. Shining the torch at his brother, he asked, even Isabelle? Especially Isabelle, replied Flattop, eyeing the blonde ponytail that was bobbing up and down about 10 meters ahead. As fate would have it, Isabelle glanced back at that very moment and waved at him. Flattop's thick lips retracted back in what he hoped was a reasonable imitation of a friendly smile, and he waved back. What's the point of traveling with a 14-year-old girl? Continued Flattop. She'll just be deadweight for the entire journey. We might as well put her in a backpack and carry her. Better to find out everything she knows and get rid of her. And if she doesn't know anything else about Nicky Zipster or the Yeti tooth, asked Maine. Flattop shrugged and grunted, then we just get rid of her. Cold, ruthless, calculating. Exactly how they had been trained. Maine shivered, and not because of the cold night. I disagree, he said. I think they are more used to us alive, especially Isabelle. If we keep them alive, we'll have a better chance of finding the Yeti tooth and finishing this mission. Taking them out now would be a serious strategic mistake. They were the right words and they got Flattop's attention. How so? He asked. Because the people in Shabrubessi will trust us more if we are part of a group that includes 3 kids. I don't get it, Flattop said, frowning. What have the kids got to do with people trusting us, and why do we want people to trust us anyway? Think about it this way, Maine began. He paused and thought about what to say. The lives of Burnmaster and his companions depended on the right choice of words. When we turn up in Shabrubessi and start asking questions about Nicky Zipster, do you think people are going to trust us enough to tell us what they know? We're 3 huge, scary-looking guys asking questions about a woman traveling alone. We could lie and say we are Nicky's friends, but people may not believe us. And if they don't believe us, they won't trust us, and if they don't trust us, they won't tell us anything. So what? Replied Flattop. If we think they know something, we'll just roll 'em too. He's ruthless and mindless, thought Maine. Nobody ever said that being a North Korean soldier was intellectually challenging. Maine shook his head. We can't roll everybody we meet because it will blow our cover story, he replied. If we travel around Nepal leaving a trail of bodies behind us, somebody will get suspicious, and the last thing we need is the Nepalese police getting involved. The best way to complete this mission is to keep people thinking we are university students and to avoid trouble. Flat Top frowned in concentration. So you think that by traveling with Isabelle and her little friends, people will think we are trustworthy? He asked. This was a mind-bendingly new concept for a commando who had been trained to shoot first and ask questions later. Maine nodded. Trustworthy and harmless, he explained. Who ever heard of soldiers traveling with kids? It's the perfect cover. We just stick with Burnmaster's group, and anything that people tell them about Nicky Zipster will be right there to hear. Now that you mention it, I think that the boy called Pemba is a Nepalese local, Flat Top said. Probably speaks the language and translates for Burnmaster. It might be a good idea to tag along and have him ask the questions. My thoughts exactly, Maine agreed. Another reason to keep them all alive, don't you think? For a little while, grunted Flat Top. Maine sighed inwardly. Burnmaster and the others were safe for now, but they would only remain that way while Flat Top believed that keeping them alive gave him a tactical advantage. As soon as their usefulness came to an end, so did their lives. Do people really think we're scary looking? Flat Top asked suddenly. What? Said Maine. You said people think we're scary looking, Flat Top said. Do you really think that's true? Maine thought about it for a moment. Yeah, I do. Why? No reason, Flat Top replied. He was quiet for a while and the pair of commandos stomped along the stony mountain road in silence. Maine stole a glance at his brother. Flat Top's posture had straightened and there was a bounce in his stride that wasn't there before. His granite jaw jutted arrogantly and there was a winning gleam in his eyes. He looked proud. Maine wondered at this change and then realized what had happened. Back in North Korea, Flat Top had trained to become the best soldier he could be. His strength and skill were virtually unmatched, and now he realized he could intimidate people through his looks alone. For many people, being described as scary-looking would have been an insult, but for Flat Top it was the highest compliment. 30 minutes later, an old flatbed truck rounded a bend on the road up ahead and rumbled towards the band of weary travelers. The GXs stood in the middle of the road as the bright headlights bore down on them. It wasn't as dangerous as it looked. The GX's hair sparkled like Christmas tinsel, and the truck driver would have had to have been asleep not to see them standing on the road. After the truck rattled to a halt, Pemba climbed up onto the footboard near the driver's door and spoke to the driver about the landslide. The local language was gobbledygook to everybody else, and without Pemba's help, it would have been difficult to get the message across. The driver, a young man from the outskirts of Kathmandu who was driving home to see his family, was dismayed to learn that the road was completely blocked. As he was going to have to return to Shabrubesi, would Pemba and his tired companions like a lift in the back of the truck? Pemba gratefully accepted the offer and quickly translated the conversation for everybody else. It was a large truck, and its flatbed back was a broad wooden platform about 5 feet off the ground. For the weary bodies of the 14-year-olds, it may as well have been 500 feet off the ground because they were almost too tired to climb up. Gulbenkian kindly boosted them into the back of the truck and then clambered up. As Flat Top graciously offered to lift Pemba up, he gave Maine a knowing wink. The wisdom of keeping the Nepalese boy alive was already paying dividends. Thanks to him, they had already arranged a ride to Shabrubesi. When everybody was seated in the back of the truck, Burnmaster banged his palm against the side to indicate to the driver that they were ready to go. The old engine rumbled to life, and with a grinding of gears the truck lurched forward, gaining speed until it was bouncing along at about 40 kilometers per hour. It was going to be a slow journey to Shabrubesi, but Burnmaster didn't mind. The winding mountain road prevented the truck from traveling any faster, but all of the twists and turns proved to be a blessing in disguise. Like so many vehicles on the roads in Nepal, the truck was a fossil and the rusty suspension was well past its expiry date. For Burnmaster and his traveling companions, that meant a rough ride sitting on the hard wooden floor, and if the truck had been traveling much faster, the jolting might have been enough to shake a tooth loose. There was no doubt the bus had been a smoother ride, but after being trapped under the landslide all night, sitting in the back of the old truck and staring up at the black expanse of the night sky felt like first-class travel. Laheeti and Twig, sitting on their rucksacks, quickly fell asleep on either side of Gulbenkian, their heads resting against his arms. Isabelle was seated next to the hulking form of Flat Top, and as she drifted off to sleep, her head lolled against the side of the giant GX. Prior to this evening, Flat Top had never met or even spoken to a 14-year-old, and now he had one of the pesky little things sleeping against him. It was an irritation that he didn't need, and his huge hands itched to toss Isabelle over the side of the truck like a rag doll. But a warning glance from Maine reminded Flat Top of their earlier conversation about the importance of the 14-year-olds, so Flat Top let Isabelle's sleeping form remain nuzzled against his arm. Soon the soft pink glow of dawn kissed the mountain tops. The sunrise meant different things to different people. For Burnmaster, it marked the end of a near-death experience he would never forget. For Maine, it was an example of nature's sublime beauty. For Mohawk, it was a source of inspiration that he would later draw upon to write music. But for Flat Top, the sunrise meant nothing. He merely opened one eye a crack and mentally calculated how many hours it had taken to travel from Kathmandu, including the time wasted saving the bus. He didn't check the exact time on his wristwatch, but for the record, it was 6:14 a.m., and the winter storm season that shook the Himalayas every year was less than a week away. Further back on the mountain road, Zaw and Abby also watched the rising sun color the eastern sky. Like the passengers on the truck, they had a considerable distance to travel before they arrived at Shabrubesi, but unlike the passengers, they had to cover the kilometers entirely on foot. If the Yetis chanced across any trucks on the mountain road, they wouldn't be accepting any offers of a lift because it might be a one-way ticket to the nearest zoo. If they saw any trucks, they would scramble out of sight as fast as their furry legs would carry them. Not long after they had seen Pemba emerge unharmed from the bus, Abby had called Shangri-La and told Pemba's father and friends the good news. They were relieved that Pemba was all right but expressed doubt that 3 human beings were able to pull a bus out of a landslide. Abby had tried to convince them that she and Zaw really had seen that happen, but nobody in Shangri-La believed her. She must be mistaken, they said. A bus of the dimensions she had described must weigh many tons. No human being or trio of human beings could drag an overturned bus along a road. Even 3 fully grown Yetis would struggle to perform a feat like that. It had been a long night, and Abby was in no mood to argue on the sat phone, so she just promised to call again soon and hung up. They had a long hike ahead of them, and their only equipment was the clothes on their backs. For a human, that would be a problem, but Yetis had no need for any equipment when traveling in the mountains. They didn't even need clothes. As Yetis were covered from head to toe in fur, the clothes were unnecessary for warmth. In Shangri-La, they wore comfortable togas made from light, colorful fabric. Abby and Zaw would have preferred to be wearing togas now, but that wouldn't help them move around in Shabrubesi without attracting any attention. When Zaw was wearing the jeans and jacket with the hood up, he could pass for a human, provided somebody didn't look him right in the face. If that happened, his furry features would give the game away, but it was unlikely he and his sister would have any problems in Shabrubesi. In terms of population, the town was a drop in the ocean compared to Kathmandu, and he had been there before, so he knew the residents weren't the curious type. Zaw and Abby had taken off their shoes, tied the shoelaces together, and hung them around their necks. For humans, shoes made walking over the stony ground comfortable, but for the Yeti, the footwear just slowed them down. Their feet were naturally built to handle the rigors of living in a mountainous environment, and their toe claws allowed them to grip the ground far better than the traction on any shoe. A Yeti had no need for human technology in order to survive in the mountains. Clothes, shoes, gloves, sunglasses, food ration packs, climbing equipment, radio gear, and medical supplies were all stock standard items that any human adventurer required to survive in the Himalayas, but for a Yeti such things were unnecessary. Their species had survived for tens of thousands of years in that environment, and they were perfectly adapted to it. Buck naked, a Yeti could survive in the Himalayas indefinitely, whereas a human would be dead in a few hours. This stark difference between the ability of a Yeti and a human to survive in the mountains was most marked at very high altitudes. There were 14 mountains in the Himalayas whose summits were higher than 8,000 meters above sea level, the highest of which was Mount Everest, towering above everything else at 8,850 meters. At those altitudes, human beings were completely dependent on their survival equipment, for without it they would die within minutes. High-altitude climbers were practically dressed for a journey to the moon. At altitudes of over 8,000 meters, there was very little oxygen in the air, and human climbers needed to take special breathing apparatus steel canisters containing compressed air, just like scuba divers used, in order to survive. Even with such equipment, humans ran the risk of being affected by high-altitude sickness. a life-threatening condition which caused the brain to swell inside the skull. Climbers affected by high-altitude sickness became utterly confused and disoriented, and if they did not immediately descend to lower altitudes where the air was richer in oxygen, they quickly died. Not so the yeti. Many thousands of years ago, evolution had waved its magic wand and blessed the yeti with physiology that was specially adapted to survive in freezing cold, low-oxygen environments. Their bodies were well insulated and extremely efficient at using oxygen, with the result that the yeti could outperform and outclimb all other creatures at very high altitudes. Human beings were the preeminent species on Earth, but in the Himalayas, they were the poor evolutionary cousins of the yeti. A practical comparison best illustrated the point. Compared to Zaw, the legendary Sir Edmund Hillary, the first human to reach the summit of Mount Everest, climbed like an amateur mountaineer with a collapsed lung. But the fact that Zaw could effortlessly survive in the mountains didn't mean he wanted to. Unbelievable, he muttered, kicking a stone along the deserted mountain road in frustration. Pemba gets a lift to Shabrubesi and we have to walk the whole way. Abby, 2 steps behind her brother, had been listening to that refrain for the past half an hour. She shook her head. "Would you stop whining about it?" she groaned. "It's going to be a long walk if you keep on like this." "I'm just saying that I wouldn't mind if a little bit of Pemba's super karma rubbed off on me," he grumbled. "It's only about 30 kilometers from here, so I'm sure you'll be able to make it," Abby sighed. "You're missing the point," Zaw said over his shoulder. "We're supposed to be in this together, but somehow Pemba always manages to get himself a sweet deal and we have to rough it." "You think that Pemba got a sweet deal?" asked Abby. "That's right," replied Zaw. "What else would you call hitching a ride to Shabrubesi while we walk?" Abby raised her eyebrows. "So I suppose you think that being trapped under a landslide all night is also a sweet deal?" Zaw shrugged. "I admit that would have been tough for a human," he conceded. "I would have dug my way out." "Sure you would have," Abby retorted. "And then flying pigs would have swooped down from the sky and carried you to Shabrubesi." Zaw looked at his sister in surprise. "You don't believe me," he shot back. "That bus was under a few meters of mud. Yetis have their limits, Zaw. Even you," Abby said. "Whatever," he muttered. "The important thing is that Pemba escaped." "I'm glad he's okay." "I know you are," she smirked. "I saw you cry after he got out of the bus." Zaw had a fleeting memory of seeing Pemba emerge from the shattered windscreen, and the immense feeling of relief at seeing his human friend was alive and well. After that, he had gotten a little misty, but he didn't realize his sister had seen it. "I did not," he scoffed. "That was sand in my eye. I know real tears when I see them," Abby pressed. "You were crying, don't worry." "I think it's sweet," she giggled and watched her brother's reaction. "You really do care about Pemba." "Not enough to cry about him, though," Zaw replied defensively. "And if you tell anybody otherwise, while you're asleep I'll shave 2 circles in your cheek fur so that you've got the apple-red cheeks of a human. It'll take weeks for your fur to grow back." Abby shot her brother a dark look. "You wouldn't dare," she growled. "Tell somebody in Shangri-La that I cried and you'll find out," he snapped back. Abby still had Zaw's phone in her jeans pocket. Pulling it out, she started scrolling through the list of contacts to Pinder's name. When her brother noticed what she was doing, he made a grab for his phone, but Abby evaded his hands and then sprinted ahead with the phone held against her ear. It wasn't actually dialing, but her brother didn't know that. Zaw ran after her. "Don't make me chase you all the way to Shabrubesi," he yelled.
That is the end of this chapter. To listen to the next chapter on YouTube or to purchase the digital ebook from Amazon, see the links in the description.